In December of 1937, one of the darkest chapters of human history unfolded. Not on a distant battlefield. Not in the heat of combat. But inside a city. A city filled with civilians. Families. Children. Elderly men and women. Its name was Nanking. The capital of China. And within 6 weeks, it would become the site of one of the most horrifying massacres of the 20th century. To understand what happened in Nanking, we must first understand the world that led to it. By the 1930s, Japan had transformed into a militarized empire. Its leaders believed expansion was not only necessary, but inevitable. China, weakened by internal conflict, became the target. In 1937, full-scale war broke out between Japan and China. What followed was brutal. But nothing prepared the world for what happened next. As Japanese forces advanced deeper into Chinese territory, city after city fell. Resistance collapsed. Refugees flooded the roads. And by December 1937, the Japanese army stood at the gates of Nanking. The Chinese government fled. Military leadership collapsed. The city was left almost defenseless. Inside remained over 600,000 civilians. They believed surrender would spare them. They were wrong. On December 13, 1937, Japanese forces entered Nanking. At first, there was no official announcement. No declaration. Just soldiers moving through the streets. Then the killing began. Not as battle. But as policy. What followed over the next 6 weeks defies comprehension. The massacre was not a single event. It was systematic. Organized. Relentless. Men were rounded up and executed in groups. Civilians were accused of being soldiers without evidence. Prisoners were used for training exercises. Mass executions took place along the Yangtze River. Bodies were dumped into the water. The river turned red. Women were not spared. Girls. Mothers. Elderly women. Thousands were assaulted. Many were killed afterward. Entire families were destroyed in front of each other. The violence was not chaotic. It was tolerated. Sometimes encouraged. Officers did little to stop it. Some participated. Homes were looted. Temples burned. Hospitals invaded. Nothing was sacred. The city became a place without law. Without mercy. Without escape. Foreign nationals who remained in Nanking watched in horror. Missionaries. Doctors. Journalists. They documented what they could. Photographs. Diaries. Letters. They created a safety zone to protect civilians. It saved thousands. But it could not stop the slaughter. Estimates vary. But historians agree. Between 200,000 and 300,000 people were killed. In just 6 weeks. Most were civilians. Many were executed after surrendering. The dead were so numerous that proper burial was impossible. Mass graves filled the outskirts of the city. What makes the Nanking Massacre especially disturbing is not only the scale, but the mindset behind it. Japanese soldiers had been conditioned to see surrender as dishonor. They were taught that the enemy was less than human. That mercy was weakness. That obedience was everything. This ideology removed restraint. And when restraint disappears, atrocity follows. The world did not immediately react. News traveled slowly. Some reports were dismissed. Others were ignored. Japan denied everything. And for years, the truth remained buried. But the people of Nanking never forgot. Survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Children who watched their parents die. Parents who lost everything. A city that never truly recovered. The Nanking Massacre was not an accident of war. It was a breakdown of humanity. A moment where discipline became cruelty. Where ideology erased empathy. Where silence allowed horror to continue. When the Japanese army fully occupied Nanking, the city ceased to exist as a place of law. There were no courts. No protection. No authority willing to intervene. Only soldiers. And civilians trapped among them. What followed was not random violence. It was a collapse of restraint on a massive scale. Once the city fell, soldiers began rounding up Chinese men. Anyone suspected of being a former soldier, or simply of fighting age, was taken away. No trials were held. No evidence was required. Groups were marched to the outskirts of the city. To riverbanks. To fields. To empty lots. Few ever returned. Eyewitnesses described lines of prisoners forced to kneel. Shots echoed through the air. Bodies fell. More were brought. Again and again. The killings were not hidden. They were done openly. Sometimes as training. Sometimes as entertainment. Soldiers competed with one another. Kept records. Took photographs. What should have shocked the conscience became routine. Civilians who tried to hide were dragged from their homes. Doors were kicked in. Rooms searched. Families separated. Those who resisted were killed. Those who complied were often killed anyway. The city became a place where survival depended entirely on chance. Women suffered unimaginably. Thousands were assaulted. Some repeatedly. Many were killed afterward to erase evidence. Age offered no protection. Neither did illness. Neither did prayer. The assaults were not isolated acts. They were widespread. Systematic. Ignored by command. The violence spilled into every part of daily life. Hospitals were raided. Patients were dragged from beds. Doctors were threatened or killed. Temples and churches, once places of refuge, were violated. Nothing was sacred. Not faith. Not age. Not innocence. Yet in the midst of this darkness, a small group of foreigners remained. Missionaries. Doctors. Teachers. They established what became known as the Nanking Safety Zone. An area meant to shelter civilians. With no weapons. No authority. Only moral courage. One of them, John Rabe, a German businessman, used his position to protect thousands. They waved flags. Filed reports. Intervened when they could. And sometimes, it worked. But even the safety zone was not truly safe. Soldiers entered anyway. People were taken. The killings continued. What makes the massacre particularly haunting is how organized it became. Bodies were burned. Dumped in rivers. Buried in mass graves. Records were destroyed. Witnesses were threatened. The goal was not only conquest, but erasure. Estimates of the dead vary. Some say 200,000. Others say over 300,000. The true number may never be known. Because many were never counted. They vanished. The massacre lasted for 6 weeks. But its effects lasted a lifetime. Survivors lived with trauma that never faded. Nightmares. Silence. Fear. Many never spoke of what they saw. Not because they forgot. But because remembering was unbearable. Outside China, the world reacted slowly. Some journalists reported the truth. Their accounts were published abroad. But international politics muted the response. Japan denied the accusations. Some foreign governments chose not to press the issue. War was spreading. Attention shifted elsewhere. And Nanking faded from headlines. Yet denial did not erase what happened. Photographs remained. Diaries survived. Testimonies accumulated. The truth existed. Even if it was ignored. What happened in Nanking was not the result of chaos alone. It was the result of ideology. A belief that the enemy was subhuman. A culture that glorified obedience and sacrifice. A military system that rewarded brutality. And when those elements combined, atrocity became inevitable. The massacre ended not because of mercy, but because the killing exhausted itself. The city lay in ruins. The population shattered. And the world moved on. But history did not forget. Even when governments tried to. Even when textbooks remained silent. The memory of Nanking endured, in survivors, in records, in truth. When the killing finally slowed, Nanking was no longer a city. It was a grave. Buildings stood empty. Streets were silent. The air carried the weight of what had happened. And yet, outside China, the world barely reacted. Not because no one knew. But because many chose not to see. Foreigners who survived inside Nanking wrote letters. They filmed what they could. They kept diaries. Their accounts described mass executions, systematic violence, and the complete breakdown of order. Some of these reports reached the outside world. Newspapers in Europe and America published fragments of the truth. But the reaction was weak. The world was already on the edge of a larger war. Political interests outweighed moral outrage. And Japan denied everything. Japanese officials claimed the reports were exaggerations. They called them enemy propaganda. They insisted their army had acted with discipline. And because the war was still ongoing, there was no immediate reckoning. No investigation. No punishment. No accountability. Inside Japan, the massacre was never openly discussed. Soldiers were praised as heroes. The public was shielded from the truth. Records were destroyed. Orders were denied. Testimonies were suppressed. The silence became official policy. After World War II ended, the world finally confronted the horrors of the conflict. The Nuremberg trials punished Nazi war criminals. But in Asia, justice moved more slowly. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal did address some of Japan's actions. A few high-ranking officers were convicted. But many responsible for Nanking were never tried. Some returned to normal life. Some held government positions. Some became respected figures. The massacre faded into the background of history. One of the most disturbing aspects was how easily responsibility disappeared. No single person claimed command. Orders were vague. Documents were missing. Blame was shifted. The massacre became something that happened, rather than something that was done. For decades, survivors waited for acknowledgement. Many never received it. Some died without ever hearing an apology. Others carried their trauma in silence. In China, the memory was preserved quietly. In Japan, it was often denied or minimized. Textbooks omitted it. Public discussion was rare. Controversy surrounded every attempt to address it. Even today, the Nanking Massacre remains politically sensitive. Some deny the scale. Others deny the intent. A few deny it entirely. But the evidence remains overwhelming. Photographs. Eyewitness accounts. Foreign diplomatic records. Survivor testimony. History does not disappear because it is inconvenient. The massacre also forced the world to confront a difficult truth. War does not only destroy soldiers. It destroys morality. It removes boundaries. And when ideology, nationalism, and dehumanization combine, civilians become targets. Nanking stands as one of the clearest examples of what happens when an army is taught that mercy is weakness. When obedience is valued above humanity. When violence is normalized. Yet even in that darkness, there were moments of courage. People who risked their lives to protect strangers. Doctors who refused to leave. Foreigners who documented the truth when silence was safer. They could not stop the massacre. But they ensured it would not be forgotten. The tragedy of Nanking is not only in how many died. It is in how long the world took to listen. And how easily denial replaced justice. History often remembers victories. It celebrates battles. But Nanking reminds us that the greatest crimes happen when no one is watching. When victims have no voice. When silence becomes policy. When the guns finally fell silent, the world moved forward. But Nanking did not. For those who survived, time did not heal what had been done. It only buried it beneath years of silence. The city was rebuilt. Streets were cleaned. Life returned. But memory remained. For decades, the massacre existed in an uncomfortable space. Too horrific to ignore. Too politically dangerous to fully acknowledge. In China, survivors passed down their stories quietly. In Japan, the subject became controversial, debated, denied, or softened. Some textbooks mentioned it briefly. Others omitted it entirely. The truth became fragmented. Yet history has a way of resurfacing. As archives opened and witnesses aged, more testimonies emerged. Diaries written by foreigners. Photographs preserved in private collections. Eyewitness accounts recorded before it was too late. Slowly, the full scale of the atrocity became undeniable. In Nanking, memorials were built. Names were engraved. Stories were preserved. Silence was replaced with remembrance. Every year, ceremonies are held. Not for revenge. But for recognition. Because remembering is the only justice many victims will ever receive. The Nanking Massacre forces the world to confront a difficult truth. Atrocities do not begin with violence. They begin with ideas. With the belief that one group is superior. That obedience matters more than conscience. That enemies are less than human. Once those ideas take hold, cruelty becomes easy. The soldiers who committed these acts were not born monsters. They were trained. Conditioned. Taught not to question. They lived in a system where obedience was virtue and doubt was weakness. And when moral restraint vanished, so did humanity. This is why Nanking still matters. Not because of numbers. Not because of politics. But because it shows how fragile civilization truly is. How quickly order can collapse. How easily silence can replace justice. The massacre also reminds us of the danger of denial. When history is erased. When suffering is minimized. When truth becomes optional. The door is left open for repetition. Remembering Nanking is not about assigning blame to future generations. It is about responsibility. The responsibility to acknowledge. To educate. To prevent. Because history does not repeat itself exactly. But it echoes. The victims of Nanking were not symbols. They were people. They had families. Dreams. Lives interrupted by unimaginable violence. They deserve more than footnotes. They deserve to be remembered. And so, the story of Nanking stands as a warning. A warning against blind loyalty. Against dehumanization. Against silence in the face of cruelty. It reminds us that the greatest danger is not hatred. But indifference. Because when the world looks away, history has a way of repeating itself.